This short lecture is on feed and feeding your bees. Now, feeding your bees is a really important part of beekeeping. And, just like all livestock, it is our responsibility as farmers to make sure that our animals are kept healthy and productive. And part of that is making sure that they have food. So why do we feed honeybees? Well, we feed honeybees because oftentimes during the season, when honeybees are getting going or they're starting to shut down, or even during the middle of the season, food can be scarce depending on what your resources are around you. And so when food is scarce, it means that if there is not enough forage in the area to produce, honey from, that they may actually start using their stores, which you want them to keep for winter, while that food is scarce. And so we want to make sure that we always have plenty of food for our bees to eat so that they don't dip into those winter stores. In addition, we also feed bees when we're installing a new colony. So when you get a new nuke or a new package, feeding them is going to be a really important part of allowing them to build up properly. We use feed also to treat bees for things like nosema and foul brood with compounds like terramycin. And so, these are incorporated into liquid feed, terramycin being an antibiotic for foul brood that are taken up by the bees basically to help them be healthy. So, even when we're talking about feed, we're not just talking about feeding bees for the purpose of just feeding them to put on weight and honey stores, things like that. But rather, we're talking about also utilizing it to help with the health of the bees, the overall health care of the bees. And always keep in mind, the bees are livestock. Your responsibility as a farmer is to make sure livestock is healthy, and part of that is feeding. So we feed generally in the spring. We also feed during dearths, which means that there is no forage available, and then also during the fall. So here in Michigan, we have a period of time, generally around the late part of July, beginning parts of August, where there's just not a lot of forage available. Our native plants in Michigan, this is a period of time that they just don't produce a lot of flowers. And so there's generally just a strapped amount of resources during that period of time. And we want to make sure that when we notice that as a beekeeper, and you will be able to tell that based on what's coming into your hive and what's on the frames when you're looking at them. If you see that there's not a lot of honey coming in, this is an opportunity for you to supplementally feed with liquid feed. So what do we feed? Well, there's just your average granulated, highly refined sugar, and then there's all sorts of fancy, expensive sugar out there on the market. You do not want any of the fancy sugar. You want refined sugar. It can be beet sugar, it can be cane sugar, whatever, but you want refined sugar, just like this Domino thing here, this bag of sugar here. The thing to keep in mind is that sugar, although we use it as a feed, that's not something that these animals are interacting with out in nature. And so the sugars that you see, like the sugar in the raw, they have a lot of minerals in them. And those are things that honeybees cannot process. What they can process is refined sucrose, which is pure cane, which is essentially granulated sugar. That sucrose can be broken down by honeybees because of the enzymes that they have, and so they can digest this. They can digest the regular cane sugar, but they cannot properly digest the more unrefined sugars. So make sure that you're utilizing the proper sugar. And the good thing for us is the cheap sugar is the stuff that we should be using. I always get a lot of questions about Honeybee Healthy, and they've got several different products now that they produce. But Honeybee Healthy, it has a lot of claims that the company claims about the product. I use the product a lot. I've used it ever since I began beekeeping. It was something that was incorporated into my mentorship when I was being brought up as a young beekeeper. And really, I'll tell you where it works and where I like it for, and what we really don't see evidence of it doing. So number one, it is a feeding stimulant. I find that when we add just a little bit of this, and I mean a little bit. So this small bottle, this 16-ounce bottle, this is the bottle I have had for 5 years. Managing somewhere between like 20 to 50 hives during those years. I still have this bottle. It's still got plenty of stuff in it. I generally, when I do a 5-gallon bucket of feed, I will add probably a tablespoon, maybe 2 tablespoons of this. And they recommend much, much more. You don't need a whole lot. Essentially what it's comprised of is mostly essential oils, and the essential oils that are in them do produce it. They do act as feed and stimulant. They tend to take the feed much more readily. In addition, if you have problems with bees accepting foundation, meaning that they just don't seem to want to draw comb off of your plastic foundation, and it's always plastic foundation that this typically happens with, what you can do, there's a couple things, but one of the things you can do is you can essentially put a little Honeybee Healthy in with sugar syrup in a spray bottle and spray the foundation with that, and then put it back in the colony. That generally will get bees attracted to that frame. One of the big things, and probably the primary reason that I use this product, is it prevents mold growth. So your sugar that you put on your colonies is not going to last forever. And over time, it will get cloudy and sour. And you want to, once it starts getting cloudy, it's time to replace it. What I have found is with this product, my feed will stay good for much, much longer. And so we use this in everything that we do, because most of the feeders that we have on our colonies are 2-gallon feeders. And so, it may take a while for the colony to get through 2 gallons of feed. I want to make sure that that feed is good the whole time. And this does a really good job of maintaining the quality of that feed and extending the life of the feed. Now, one of the big things that they advertise for this is that it boosts the immune system. I've not seen any evidence of this, and I don't know of any research that has correlated an immune system response with Honeybee Healthy. But like I said, I do like the product, but I like it for the reasons that I've listed above this, not for the idea that it's going to boost the immune system of my honeybees. Pollen patties. So this is another thing that we're going to be feeding. You need to be feeding pollen patties because they provide the protein that bees need to produce young, so to rear their brood. And oftentimes you need to be thinking about, when is this an important thing? Well, it's important early in the season to have on, because oftentimes we don't have a lot of floral resources available during this early part of the season. And so you need to make sure that there's plenty of pollen in the colony so that they can utilize that pollen to rear brood. Now, one thing to keep in mind, pollen patties are not stored as pollen. So the pollen that you see stored in frames, that is pollen from plants. This is not stored as pollen. This is used immediately by the bees. And so you need to recognize that, by putting this on here, you're basically allowing them to feed directly on this patty and have access to immediate pollen that can be used for food. But it's not going to augment your stores, other than it's taking some of the pressure off of those stores because you have an alternative food source here. So you're going to use those primarily early in the season and also late in the season. As things kind of wind down in the season, you get towards September, end of September, there's not a lot of floral resources out there. Bees are still being raised, and the bees that are being raised are your winter bees during that time of the year. So you want to make sure that you have adequate food stores, because those need to be big, fat, healthy bees going into the winter. All right, so how do we feed? Well, the things you are going to need, and this depends on the scale of your operation. So if you have more than a few colonies, I'd say 4 or 5 colonies, and you're feeding them with gallon feeders, you could do the 5-gallon bucket approach. If you have just a couple of hives that you're doing Boardman feeders with, half-gallon mason jars or something like that, you can mix this mixture in the mason jar itself. But for those of you who have more hives, you're going to have to do this in a 5-gallon bucket for the most part. The things that you're going to need are a bucket, sugar, a drill, and a paint mixer. The paint mixer and the drill are critical. When you're mixing 5 gallons of sugar water, it is very tough to get that into solution. And in addition, once you get into the fall and you start feeding heavy syrup, meaning it's a higher concentration of sugar to water, it gets really tough. So the paint mixer is critical. And you want to make sure that you have a paint mixer that is dedicated to this. You don't want to contaminate this with anything else. So how do you feed? Well, there's a couple tricks to this, and sometimes people get hung up on the idea of this 1-to-1 mixture, because essentially sugar and water weigh different amounts. And so if you're saying this is a 1-to-1 mixture, we're talking about a volume ratio. So we're talking about 1 gallon of sugar to 1 gallon of water, and those weights are different when we say that that's a 1-to-1 mixture, but they're not that different. And so when you're looking at this and mixing your feed, The rule of thumb is that, if you're going to put a gallon of water in, you put a gallon of sugar in because the weights are essentially the same. And this makes it really easy for mixing. The down and dirty way that I do things, if you're doing 5 gallons of feed, you need 25 pounds of sugar. There you go. 25 pounds of sugar, you put it in a bucket, you fill it with water, and you mix it down. When you're filling with water, one thing to keep in mind is if you are, if you're doing a 5-gallon bucket, maybe you don't have access to hot water, I would encourage you to mix with hot water though. Mixing initially with hot water, it helps everything dissolve much, much quicker and makes it much easier to get the sugar into a solution. Cold water works, you're just gonna be spinning that drill a whole heck of a lot longer. But if you can, use hot water when you are mixing this. So here's your syrup recipes that you're going to use. And these are something that you just need to keep in your mind and something that will just become second nature over time. So spring and summer. So we're talking June through August here. It's really earlier than that. We essentially could be feeding as early as March, depending on the weather or where you're at. But June, I put in there as kind of an arbitrary date. But essentially in the spring is when we start feeding. And you're going to start by feeding 1-to-1 sugar water. And that means you have 1 gallon of sugar for 1 gallon of water. And what this does, this mixture, when you feed at this time of the season, it stimulates egg laying, it helps with drawing out comb, and it allows them to feed the brood. When we're looking at fall, so September through October, this is when we start heavy feeding. Now, this could start earlier too. Generally, if you have light colonies, meaning they don't have a lot of honey stores, you're going to want to start feeding much earlier than September, potentially even the beginning of August. So it just depends on what your bees require. But essentially what you're trying to do is you're adding weight to the bees and you're increasing winter stores. So allowing them to feed on the supplemental feed rather than feeding on honey stores is a really important part of limiting the amount of stores that they go through in the fall. Also allows them to add weight to both themselves and the colony. All right, so we've heard a little bit about feeders previously. I'm just going to cover them one more time. So lots of ways you can feed your bees. To the left, you see a Boardman feeder. The middle, you see a top feeder for a hive. And then to the right, you see a frame feeder. These are all different types of feeders. There's a lot of different feeders out there. I will say, and I think I've said this before, the Boardman feeder is nice if you have your colonies nearby. The top feeders are nice because they have much higher capacity. This middle top feeder and the frame feeder are both 2-gallon feeders, so a lot more feed than that mason jar that's out on the front of that Boardman feeder. So if you have yards that are further away, I recommend having something that has more capacity. The one frame, I will say this, the one in the middle here, I've used these for years. They work good for about I'd say maybe 4 seasons, and then they start to fall apart, basically from the bottom. The frame feeders work awesome. I've used those before as well. Boardman feeder, again, the nice thing about that is you can hand mix them. It's something you can visually see. For those of you that are beginning, this is nice because you get a sense of how much they're actually eating, and that is something that you should note beginning. In the early years, it's just how much of the sugar water they go through, which is a lot. Top feeders like this one, you feed from the top, the bees come up through the middle, and then they use these lattice structures to walk on. So these are the reservoirs that the sugar water is in. You always need to have something for them to climb on because bees are terrible swimmers. Top feeders, so I showed you that top feeder the last slide. This is another solution and one that we use. You can pretty much use any bucket that you have that will hold a vacuum. Essentially this, I think it looks like an ice cream pail. This is a 2-gallon bucket from Ace Hardware. And essentially you just punch holes in the bottom of it. You can, essentially the size you're looking for is about a 1/16 of an inch for a drill bit, but you can punch some holes in that with the drill bit. And then what you do is you just, when you flip it over, you have to make sure that all that water or the sugar water that's coming out kind of stops at some point. It will stop at some point to hold vacuum because of the viscosity of sugar water. And at that point, you put it on the colony. There is so one bad thing about these feeders, and it does happen occasionally, is that if the bucket loses vacuum, all of that sugar water dumps down into your colony. Now, if you're in the warm season, it won't kill the colony, but if you are in the spring and we are still in freezing temperatures, you can potentially freeze out a cluster this way. A way to kind of change that approach is, and this is generally how we do it in my own personal operation, is I would not put this bucket feeder right in the middle. What we do is we actually put the bucket feeder right on top of the frames, and we normally relegate it to a side of the colony. That way, if it does end up dumping out, it's not dumping directly down onto the brood chamber and the clusters. More so, it's like at the edge of the frame, and is not going to interact so much with the bees. Frame feeders, really nice. You end up replacing a couple frames and putting this in there. Great way to feed the bees. The one thing that's kind of a limitation is the bucket feeders and the top feeders and Boardman feeders. You know, you have minimal interaction with your bees when you're working with those. This one, you actually are getting into the colony and adding the feed there. But this works very well. It's good for, you know, not encouraging robbing because it's inside of the colony. And that's all we have for today. Thanks for joining me for this lecture.